Picture this. In the heart of ancient Rome, beneath the marble floors of the most sacred temple, archaeologists discovered something that chilled them to the bone. Stone chambers, underground, and inside, the remains of young women, buried alive with nothing but a loaf of bread and a lamp that had long since burned out. These were not criminals. These were not slaves. These were among the most revered women in all of Rome, the Vestal Virgins. Women so powerful that emperors bowed before them, so sacred that their word could free condemned men from death itself. But what promise could be so vital to the very survival of the Roman Empire that breaking it meant being sealed alive in the earth? What secret did these women guard that was worth more than life itself? The answer lies buried in the darkest corners of Roman history, in a duty so sacred that it could bring down nations, and a power so absolute that it terrified the very men who ruled the world. This is their story, and it will change everything you thought you knew about ancient Rome. To understand the Vestal Virgins, we must first understand the flame they guarded. In the heart of Rome, within the circular temple of Vesta, burned a fire that had never been allowed to die. Not for a single day, not for a single hour. For over 1,000 years, this sacred flame flickered in the darkness, and the Romans believed with absolute certainty that their very existence depended upon it. But this was no ordinary fire. According to Roman legend, this flame was brought to Italy by the Trojan hero Aeneas himself, the mythical founder of the Roman people. When Troy fell to the Greeks, Aeneas carried the sacred fire of his homeland across the Mediterranean Sea. This flame represented the eternal spirit of Troy, reborn in Rome. The Temple of Vesta stood at the very center of Roman religious life in the Forum itself. Its round shape was said to represent the ancient huts of Rome's earliest settlers. Inside this temple, no statues stood, only the eternal flame and the sacred objects of Rome's most ancient rituals. The Romans lived in terror of what would happen if this flame ever died. Ancient texts speak of omens and disasters that would follow such a catastrophe. The gods would abandon Rome. Enemies would pour through the gates. The empire itself would collapse into ash and ruin. But who could be trusted with such an awesome responsibility? Who could guard the very soul of Rome itself? The answer would shape the lives of hundreds of young women across 1,000 years of Roman history. The process of choosing a Vestal Virgin was unlike anything else in the Roman world. When one of the 6 priestesses died or completed her 30 years of service, the search would begin for her replacement. The candidate had to be perfect in every way. She must be between 6 and 10 years old enough to understand her duties, but young enough to be molded by the sacred life ahead. She had to come from a noble family, with both parents still living and married to each other. No physical defect could mar her body. No scandal could touch her family name. Most importantly, she had to be chosen by the gods themselves. The Pontifex Maximus, Rome's highest priest, would gather the eligible girls in the Forum. One by one, he would examine them, looking not just at their physical form but searching for divine signs. The Romans believed the gods would reveal their chosen vessel through omens and portents. When the selection was made, the girl would be taken from her family immediately. There were no goodbyes, no farewells. She belonged to Vesta now, and her old life ceased to exist. But what awaited her was not imprisonment. It was power beyond imagination. The moment a girl became a Vestal Virgin, she gained legal rights that even Roman matrons could never dream of. She could own property. She could make a will. She could conduct business. In a world where women were always under the authority of fathers or husbands, the Vestals answered only to the goddess and the Pontifex Maximus. Their sacred person was inviolable. To harm a Vestal Virgin was to invite the wrath of the gods. Even the highest magistrates stepped aside when they approached. If a condemned criminal happened to encounter a Vestal on his way to execution, she could grant him freedom with a single word, and no one could overrule her decision. They lived in luxury within their sacred residence, the House of Vestal Virgins, adjacent to their temple. Slaves attended their every need. The finest foods graced their table. They wore robes of the purest white, with purple trim that marked their sacred status. But with such privilege came a burden that would define every moment of their lives. The life of a Vestal Virgin followed rhythms as old as Rome itself. Every dawn brought the same sacred obligations that their predecessors had performed for centuries. Their first and most crucial duty was tending the eternal flame. This was not simply adding wood to a fire. The Vestals used only specific types of wood, cut at certain times of the year, blessed in ancient rituals. The flame had to burn at exactly the right height, with precisely the right color. Any deviation could signal divine displeasure. They prepared the sacred salt used in all Roman religious ceremonies, the mola salsa. This mixture of salt and ground grain was created through rituals so ancient that their origins were lost in the mists of time. Without this sacred salt, no proper sacrifice could be offered to the gods. During Rome's great festivals, the Vestals played central roles. At the Vestalia, their most important celebration, the inner sanctum of their temple was open to Roman matrons, who came to receive blessings for their households. The Vestals would sprinkle holy water and offer prayers for the continued prosperity of Rome. But perhaps their most mysterious duty involved the sacred objects kept within their temple, objects so holy that no one outside their order was permitted even to know what they were. Ancient texts hint at relics brought from Troy, symbols of Rome's divine mandate, artifacts that connected the present empire to its mythical past. The Vestals alone knew these secrets. The Vestals alone could touch these sacred things. And the Vestals alone understood the full extent of their responsibility to Rome. Yet beneath all these duties lay the one requirement that overshadowed everything else, the vow that would determine whether they lived or died. When a girl became a Vestal Virgin, she made a promise that would govern every heartbeat of the next 30 years. She vowed to remain pure, untouched, devoted only to the goddess Vesta. This was not merely a personal commitment, it was a sacred contract between Rome and the divine. The Romans believed that the spiritual power of the Vestals flowed directly from their purity. Like the eternal flame they tended, their chastity was seen as a source of divine energy that protected the empire. As long as they remained pure, Rome would remain blessed by the gods. But what made this vow so different from the celibacy required of priests in other cultures? The answer lay in Roman religious thought itself. The Romans saw the universe as governed by precise spiritual laws. Purity generated power. Violation brought contamination. When a Vestal Virgin broke her vow, she didn't just sin against the goddess, she ruptured the very fabric that held Rome's divine protection in place. Historical records show us glimpses of how seriously this was taken. During times of military defeat or natural disaster, Romans would sometimes wonder, had one of the Vestals secretly broken her vow? Was divine punishment falling upon the city because of hidden impurity? The pressure on these women was unimaginable. Every friendship was scrutinized. Every conversation was analyzed. The slightest suggestion of impropriety could destroy not just the Vestal herself, but potentially threaten the entire empire. Some Vestals lived their entire 30 years without suspicion ever falling upon them. They completed their service with honor and either remained in the temple as elder priestesses or left to marry and start families in their 40s. But others were not so fortunate. When accusation came, it came with the full weight of Roman justice. And that justice was swift, certain, and absolutely terrifying. When a Vestal Virgin was accused of breaking her vow, the very foundations of Rome seemed to shake. These were not ordinary trials, they were cosmic events that could determine the fate of the empire itself. The accused Vestal would be brought before a tribunal of priests, led by the Pontifex Maximus. But this was no mere legal proceeding. The Romans believed they were investigating not just a crime, but a potential breach in their contract with the gods. Evidence was gathered with terrifying thoroughness. Witnesses were called. Slaves were tortured to extract testimony. Every detail of the Vestal's life was examined under the harsh light of suspicion. Some of the most famous cases have come down to us through history. During the reign of Emperor Domitian, the chief Vestal Cornelia was accused and condemned based on evidence so thin that even Roman historians questioned the verdict. Yet she was executed nonetheless, because the mere suspicion was enough to threaten Rome's spiritual security. The psychological torture was as brutal as any physical punishment. These women, who had lived lives of absolute privilege and respect, suddenly found themselves treated as traitors to the empire. Friends abandoned them. Servants whispered behind their backs. The entire weight of Roman society pressed down upon them. If found guilty, there was no appeal, no mercy, no reprieve. There was only the Campus Celeratus, the evil field where the ultimate punishment awaited. When a Vestal Virgin was condemned, Rome enacted one of the most chilling death sentences in human history. But the Romans, in their twisted logic, claimed they were not executing her at all. The condemned Vestal would be stripped of her sacred white robes and dressed instead as a corpse, in the dark garments of the dead. Her head would be covered, her face hidden from the light of the sun she would never see again. A solemn procession would form, but this was no ordinary funeral march. It was a parade of divine justice moving through the streets of Rome. Citizens lined the roads in absolute silence. No one spoke, no one wept. The very air seemed heavy with the weight of cosmic consequence. The destination was the Campus Celeratus, a field outside the city walls where the earth itself seemed cursed. Here, Roman workers had dug a small chamber beneath the ground. Inside, they placed a bed, a lamp with oil, and a small portion of bread and water. The condemned Vestal was lowered into this underground tomb. The entrance was sealed with heavy stones. Earth was piled on top. Within hours, no trace remained that this chamber existed. The Romans told themselves they had not killed her. They had simply placed her underground and allowed the gods to decide her fate. If she was truly innocent, surely the goddess Vesta would protect her. If she was guilty, then divine justice would take its course. But everyone knew the truth. Sealed in darkness, with only enough food for a few days, the Vestal would face a slow, agonizing death by starvation and suffocation. Yet even this horrific punishment served a purpose in Roman thinking. They believed that the death of an impure Vestal would cleanse the spiritual contamination she had brought upon Rome. Her suffering would restore the broken contract with the gods. But why? What made these women so important that their violation could threaten an entire empire? What secret power did they possess that made their purity worth such a terrible price? To understand the true power of the Vestal Virgins, we must look beyond the flame they tended to the deeper spiritual beliefs that governed Roman life. The Romans saw their empire not as a mere political entity, but as a sacred covenant with the divine. The Vestal Virgins were more than priestesses. They were living embodiments of Rome's relationship with the gods. Their purity represented the spiritual integrity of the entire empire. Their flame connected Rome to its mythical past and guaranteed its eternal future. In Roman religious thought, the universe operated on principles of spiritual exchange. The gods protected Rome in return for proper worship, correct rituals, and above all, the maintenance of sacred purity. The Vestals were the guarantors of this cosmic contract. When a Vestal broke her vow, she didn't just commit a personal sin, she ruptured the very spiritual foundation upon which Roman power rested. The contamination of her impurity would spread like poison through the empire's divine protection, leaving Rome vulnerable to its enemies and abandoned by its gods. This is why the punishment was so extreme, so absolute, so terrifying. The Romans believed they were not just executing a wayward priestess. They were performing a desperate act of spiritual surgery, cutting away the infected part before it could destroy the whole. Historical evidence supports this interpretation. Whenever Rome faced military disasters or natural calamities, one of the first suspicions was that a Vestal had secretly broken her vow. The health of the empire was seen as directly connected to the purity of these 6 women. The power they wielded was absolute because the fear they inspired was cosmic. Emperors who commanded legions and ruled nations trembled at the thought that a Vestal's hidden transgression might bring divine wrath upon Rome. For over 1,000 years, the Vestal Virgins maintained their sacred watch. Empires rose and fell around them, but the eternal flame burned on, tended by hands that never wavered in their duty. The last Vestal flame was extinguished in 394 AD, when the Christian Emperor Theodosius ordered the closure of all pagan temples. The final priestesses dispersed into history, carrying with them secrets that died with them. The chambers beneath the Campus Celeratus stand empty now, their stones scattered by time and weather. Archaeological excavations have revealed the remains of several women, buried alive in the darkness, their names lost to history. But the power these women wielded, the power of absolute faith and terrible consequence, echoes through the ages as one of the most chilling examples of how far civilizations will go to preserve what they hold most sacred. They were the guardians of Rome's soul, the keepers of its divine contract, the living symbols of an empire's desperate need to believe that its power came not from swords and shields, but from the favor of the gods themselves. In the end, the Vestal Virgins embodied both the greatest glory and the darkest horror of Roman civilization, the glory of absolute devotion, and the horror of what that devotion could demand from those who served it. The flame they tended has long since died, but the questions their lives raise about faith, power, and the price of serving something greater than ourselves burn as brightly as ever in the human imagination.